If you have ever lived in Los Angeles, driven through it, or just heard of it, listen closely. A real document names the exact people who founded it, and it does not call most of them Spanish. September 4th, 1781, 44 settlers walk into a dry riverbed in California and found a town, Los Angeles. The governor's own recruitment papers wrote down exactly who they were, and here's the first number you actually need. Only 2 of them were recorded as Spanish. Sit with that for a second because it's really the whole video. 2 out of 44. Would that number surprise the version of this story you already know? Here's who was actually doing the recruiting and why it matters to you. Spain needed bodies to hold a coastline it barely controlled. A governor named Neve was told to fill a new Pueblo fast. He wasn't recruiting nobility. He was recruiting whoever would actually go. Recruiters went through the frontier provinces of New Spain, offering land, tools, and a small salary to anyone willing to walk north and start over. And Spain's own bureaucracy, being Spain's bureaucracy, wrote down the exact cast of every single person who said yes. That's the part worth pausing on. The same empire that built an entire racial hierarchy also built the paperwork that quietly proves it wasn't real the way the myth tells it. Would you trust a system's own numbers to contradict its own story? And Spain wasn't founding these towns for fun. Russian fur traders were already working their way down the Pacific coast from Alaska. British ships were charting the same waters. If Spain didn't put actual settlers on that ground, somebody else eventually would. So an empire's entire coastal strategy against 2 rival powers came down to whichever ordinary families were actually willing to make that walk. Not soldiers, not nobility. Farmers, laborers, people the caste system itself ranked near the bottom. And Neve was not exactly spoiled for choice. Nobody with money or status wanted to walk hundreds of miles into unmapped territory to start a town from nothing. The people who said yes were, almost by definition, the people with the least to lose and the least social standing to protect. So the very people Spain's own caste system ranked lowest were exactly the people willing to actually go build the empire's edge for it. That's not an accident of casting. That's who accepts a hard, uncertain offer in any century you want to name. So let's actually read it, not a summary of the census itself. 2, 1 mestizo, 9 recorded as Indio, and most of the rest recorded as or Negro. Historians who tallied the full roll count that well over half the founders of Los Angeles had African ancestry, recorded in Spain's own paperwork in 1781. 11 families made that walk together and their names are still on the record. Rosas, Mesa. Read that list slowly. Does any single one of them look familiar to you? 11 families sound small until you actually count the people inside them. 44 settlers total. Only 22 of them were the adult heads of households Spain actually recruited. The rest were children. Kids walking 1,000 miles before most of them could even read the document that classified them. Half the people on that walk were children. An entire generation of Los Angeles residents started their lives trudging through desert scrubland behind their parents' mules. None of them had any idea they'd become the answer to a trivia question 2.5 centuries later. You already know some of these families, even if you never learned their names in school. Do the words boulevard sound familiar? That street carries a founding family's name. So do a few other streets hiding in plain sight on the map of the city today. Here's the one that surprises people the most. The neighborhood called Los Hills Cafes, a famous observatory nearby, is named directly after one of the founding names on that same 1781 roll. Millions of dollars in real estate, sitting on a hillside named for a man Spain's own census did not record as. Nobody buying a house in that neighborhood today is thinking about a caste record from 1781, but the name on the street sign came from that exact document, whether the buyer knows it or not. Doesn't it change how a place feels once you know what its own name is actually carrying? And isn't alone. Look closely at a modern Los Angeles map. Founding surnames are scattered across it, mostly unremarked, mostly unnoticed by the millions of people who drive past them every single day without a second thought. Most of these 11 surnames never got a boulevard named after them at all. They just faded into ordinary family names, carried quietly by their descendants, disconnected from the founding role that started them in this exact place. How many people with these last names in Los Angeles today have any idea they're on it? Now take one specific household off that roll, because a list of surnames is easy to skim past. Picture an actual family walking, not just a name in a table. A husband and wife walking north for weeks with everything they owned on their backs and on a handful of mules, toward a piece of land they had never actually seen, on the strength of one recruiter's promise. That's not a metaphor. That's literally what the trip from Sonora to California required in 1781. Over 1,000 miles, much of it desert, on trails that weren't reliably mapped, with children and livestock in tow. And when they finally arrived, there was no town waiting for them. There was a riverbed, some scattered trees, and a governor's promise that this specific spot would eventually become something. Would you have signed up for that on a stranger's word alone? And here's the detail the myth always leaves out. They weren't founding separate settlements by race and merging later. They stood on the same dry riverbed on the same morning on the same census page, in Indio and side by side. What does it do to a city's whole origin story when the founding document itself doesn't match the founding myth you were handed? So how did a well-documented census turn into a story about Spanish founders? The short answer is, slowly, and mostly not by accident, mostly after 1848. After the American takeover, being called Spanish carried real social weight, and being recorded as or Indio carried none at all. So the retelling, decade after decade, quietly kept the version that read better and dropped the census that didn't. Nobody had to destroy the document, they just had to stop mentioning it at dinner. You've probably already seen this exact pattern once before if you watched the video on this channel about California's land grant families. A real document sits in an archive, unglamorous and inconvenient, while a cleaner story keeps getting repeated instead, simply because it's easier to say out loud. By the early 1900s, Los Angeles boosters were actively selling something they called the Spanish fantasy past. Mission-style architecture, romantic postcards, festivals built around an imagined golden age of Spanish dons, and it sold real estate. It also buried a census. A marketing campaign for tourists and land buyers ended up outliving the actual historical record it was supposedly based on. And it worked so well that most people in Los Angeles today have genuinely never heard the real breakdown of their own city's founding role. It's worth being honest about what these caste labels actually controlled, because they weren't just words on a page. In colonial Spanish America, your recorded could decide what jobs you were legally allowed to hold, what taxes you paid, even what church pew you were permitted to sit in. So when 9 of the founders of Los Angeles were recorded as Indio, and most of the rest as that wasn't a neutral bureaucratic detail. It came with real legal weight attached to it, in the exact same empire that then sent them 1,000 miles to go build a town for it. Ranked at the bottom of the empire's own hierarchy, and still handed the hardest, riskiest job on the entire frontier. Sit with that contradiction for a second, because the myth never has to. The system even reached into who you were legally allowed to marry. On paper, crossing certain caste lines required special permission, extra paperwork, sometimes an outright denial from a local official. But out on an actual frontier, with 11 families depending on each other to survive drought, disease, and total isolation, those neat categories didn't hold up the way they did back in Mexico City. People married across caste lines anyway, worked the same fields anyway, raised children who blurred every category the empire had bothered to write down. Which do you think decided daily life in that Pueblo more, the paperwork, or the people actually living it? Los Angeles is now the second largest city in the United States. Nearly 4 million people live there today, and its own founding document, in Spain's own handwriting, says the founders were mostly not Spanish at all. Every single one of those 4 million people lives in a city that began as 44 names on one census roll. 2. The rest, everything the postcard version of the story quietly left out. How many other American cities have a founding story that would look completely different if people just actually read the census? So here's what actually matters for you tonight. This isn't a lost document sealed away somewhere. Historians have already done the hard part of reconstructing it, and you can read their sourcing yourself for free. Historian William Mason's research at Cal State laid out the full roll and its sourcing decades ago. The Huntington Library holds the colonial California records behind it, and the city's own El Pueblo historical monument now acknowledges the founders' actual recorded ancestry, right where tourists walk every day. You can actually go stand where this happened. The plaza at El Pueblo, Los Angeles historical monument, sits close to the original 1781 site, right downtown. Millions of tourists take photos there every single year. Almost none of them ever read the plaque about who actually stood there first. And this isn't only about Los Angeles. If any branch of your family traces to Spanish colonial territory anywhere in the Americas, this same kind of record exists for that region too. Parish and census pages with notations, usually digitized, usually searchable by surname for free. Search your own surname alongside the region, not just a specific town, since families moved constantly on the frontier. Baptism records especially tend to carry the exact same kind of notation this whole video has been built around. It's the same kind of paper trail, waiting under a different family name. If your own family traces back to early California, or you've simply always assumed Los Angeles started as a purely Spanish town, tonight is a genuinely good night to check that assumption against the actual document instead of the postcard version you grew up hearing. This matters even more now than it used to. So many people take DNA tests expecting one tidy category back. Instead, they get something messier, more mixed, more interesting. A result that blends indigenous, African, and European ancestry isn't a glitch. For huge numbers of California families, it's just the actual record, finally catching up to what the census already said back in 1781. So if your own results ever came back more mixed than the family story led you to expect, maybe the surprise was never really in the test tube. Maybe it was always sitting in a census page nobody had shown you yet. And Los Angeles was not unique. San was founded the same way 4 years earlier by a similar mixed group of recruited settlers. So was San's civilian population not long after. If your family's roots trace to early Spanish California anywhere along that coast, this same pattern of caste records versus later mythology is very likely sitting in your own family's paper trail too, not just this one city's. This isn't a one-city story. It's how an entire coastline of towns got founded, and it's how an entire coastline of founding myths later got quietly cleaned up. Once you know to look for the pattern, you start seeing it everywhere in early California history. Every one of those 44 people did the same thing. They walked north on a promise of land and put their name and their recorded caste on the same page together, whether Spain called them or not. The city grew up around a cleaner myth, but the census remembered every one of them exactly as they actually were. Which version of that founding do you think the people who actually made that walk would rather be remembered by? Tell me in the comments if any of these 11 founding surnames match your own family. And if a real document quietly overturning a comfortable myth is your kind of story, the video on this channel about California's land grant families is built from exactly the same kind of paper trail.